Hi, everybody. This is your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist Patty Wilson. And Patty, again, a mystery episode that I don't know about, but we're soon to find out.
Tonight it's all about curses.
Oh, and not the four-letter ones?
Not the four-letter
Okay.
kind, no. So several years ago, my dear friend Mark Nesbitt and I were asked to work on a book called Cursed in Pennsylvania. And I originally we talked a lot about whether we should accept this challenge or not because we weren't sure how many curses we were going to find. And then I realized that I had curses in my own family. I'd like to tell you a couple of those tonight as well,
Okay.
because they're things that I've lived through my whole life. And then, that begged other questions and things like, how does one get cursed? What does one do if one is cursed? Things like that. So we went on a kind of an educational journey as we accepted the project. And I want to share a little bit of that. And like I said, a little bit about my own family and a couple things that have happened to us that were a kind of curse, if you will. So the first one is actually from my grandmother, and this was a story I grew up hearing. In fact, it's one of the very first stories I ever wrote. So when my grandmother was young and married, she had two little ones, a little girl named Jacqueline and another little girl named Barb. And when Barb was just an infant, they were living in a little town in Somerset County, Pennsylvania called Acosta. And there was this neighbor woman who lived a couple blocks away who would walk down the street. And my grandmother got to noticing that every time this woman was near, Aunt Barb would just lay there bawling and crying, and she would just scream her head off and nothing would satisfy her. And when this lady left, then Barb would calm down. And at first, my grandma thought it was a bunch of hooey, but it happened multiple times. And this woman would make a point, like if grandma's in the backyard hanging laundry up and she had the baby, out on the grass on a blanket beside her in the backyard, this woman would walk around the house to the backyard and say, "Oh, are you out here today, Helen?" And as soon as she crossed the threshold, even if she didn't say a word yet, the baby would start to scream and just turn red and yell and scream and just like she was hysterical. And after this had happened many times, my grandma finally talked to her next door neighbor, who was an older Italian woman, first generation Italian in the United States. And she said, this sounds crazy, but there's something about Mrs. So and so that every time she's nearby, my little baby Barbie just screams and cries. And she's like, I don't understand it. And the older lady, the old Italian lady, she said, it's because she's not a nice lady. She's put a curse on that baby. And my grandma's like, I wouldn't go that far. I don't believe in curses and stuff. And she's like, well, what do you got to lose? And she's like, well, how do you know it's a curse? And she said, I want you to put some pins, like straight pins, in the bottom of a chair that has a soft cushion. Put them in so that they're pointed upward. And then put the back of the cushion back on, the hard wooden part, so that the pins can't go anywhere. And when that woman comes, offer her that chair. If she can sit in that chair and she doesn't feel the pins pushing through, that's the proof that she cursed that baby. Well, my grandma felt like a heel. She truly did. And she said it took her weeks more of Barb crying before, out of desperation, because this woman just seemed to be in her backyard or in front of her house or following her down the aisle in the grocery store daily. She finally broke down and took one of the kitchen chairs, the extra one, and sat in the corner. When my grandfather was at work, she pulled the backing off the chair. She tucked in those pins straight up. And she put the back on the chair. And she sat a basket of laundry on the chair so that nobody'd sit on it. But she tried it herself, and you could feel them when you put your weight on the chair. And so it didn't take long, maybe a day or two, and the woman was there at the house, and she's like, it just so happened she said something along the lines of she could use a little refreshment or something. And meanwhile, the baby's just screaming and bawling. And normally my grandmother would have excused herself and said, well, I'm so sorry, but I got to go tend to the baby. But on this day, because she had that chair ready, she said, well, why don't you come in? I can make you a cup of tea. And the woman followed her into the house, and she sat the basket down on the floor and offered her the chair and put the kettle on to heat. And the woman sat on the chair, and there wasn't any response, none. And my grandmother caught her breath, and she tried to be, civil and polite. And meanwhile, the baby's just crying and crying. And the woman said, "Is that baby going to cry all the time?" And she's like, "Yeah." And she's like, "Well, she's not at all like my child. My grandchild is this wonderful baby that never makes a fuss and blah blah blah." And she's like, "And it's just not very comfortable um, having that baby crying the whole time. We aren't going to be able to talk. How about we do this another day, Helen?" And she got up and left. And my grandmother stood there looking at that chair, and she thought, she bent the needles. That's what happened. The pins, she bent them when she sat down. That's got to be it. And so she sat down gingerly on the chair, and she found that they weren't bent at all. They were there. So she put the chair back in the corner, put the basket back on the chair, went running over to the neighbor lady and said, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe it." But she sat on the chair, and she told her everything. Well, the old lady told her, she said, "The next time she comes by, you take the wet pea diaper off your little baby girl Barbie, and I want you to take it, and I want you to pinch it between the window and the window sill. Lift the window up and pinch it between. And then she said, I want you to say this prayer." And she gave her this little prayer. It was basically a little Christian prayer,
Hmm.
about protecting the baby and all of this. And my grandma did exactly what she was told. She said she felt like an absolute fool, but she did it. And nothing happened. The next time the woman came by, the baby cried, and the next time the baby cried, and the next time the baby cried. So finally she went back over to the old Italian lady, and she said that wasn't it. Must not have been a curse. And she said, "Well, I still think it's a curse. I just think you don't have there wasn't enough power in that little prayer I gave you." She's like, "This is going to take more force." And my grandma's like, "I don't know." She was still not sold on this whole curse idea. So she, the old lady said to her, "No, you get a cup of salt, and I want you to start at the top of your house, and you make a route around every outside wall, saying, 'In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I cast all negative entities out of my home.' And you're going to sprinkle this salt along the edges of the walls. And I want you to end at either your front or your back door. Your front door is best. And you're going to throw out all the rest of that salt, and that'll break the curse." So again, a few days go by. The baby's crying all the time. And sure enough, it got to the point where my grandma said the baby be in the house, and this woman would walk by and stop in front of the house. And she said she started watching out the window, and she'd see the woman stop. And as soon as the baby would start to cry, she'd smile, stand there a few more seconds, and then leave. Well, finally, after a few days of watching this happen, my grandma waited till her husband was gone, and she got that cup of salt, and she went through that whole process just like she was told. And she said, "I felt the right fool throwing that cup of good salt out on out on the stoop." But she did it. And later that day, the woman came by, and she stood in front of the house, and nothing happened. My grandma was watching from one of the windows. So the lady walked up to the door and knocked on the door, and my grandma went and answered the door, and she's like, "Is everything okay, Helen?" And my grandma's like, "Yeah, I think everything's just fine." And she's like, "Well, I always hear that little girl of yours crying, and I just didn't hear her today." And she's like, "Well, we were cleaning house this morning, and I think that whatever was in this house got swept away." And she's like, "Well, I don't know what to say about that." And she sort of huffed and hummed a little bit, and then she walked away. And she said the woman came by 3 or 4 times over the next couple days and would stand outside the house looking very puzzled. And she said, I know it sounds crazy, but I think she put some sort of a curse or something on Barbie that made her cry. Why she would do such a thing, I do not know. But she said the baby never cried after that, not just because that woman was walking by.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was, there's It was a story I actually grew up on, and I can't explain it, but I can only tell you that my grandmother swore it was true. And like 100 million other people, I will tell you my grandma wasn't a liar. She wasn't. And I grew up with a lot of really interesting stories, but that was one of the stories that she often told because it still puzzled her throughout her life how that could be, how it worked that way. But it apparently did for them.
And how the curse was applied in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, and that's sort of when when we got offered that book, that's the kind of stuff that stuck in my head and stuff that I wanted to know a little bit more about. So we set out on a journey to find out that curses could happen in a lot of different ways. And sometimes you inadvertently curse yourself. Sometimes others curse you. And sometimes it's deliberate and sometimes it's not deliberate. So I thought we would visit a few different cursed stories. The first one that I wanted to talk about of those stories would be how a person curses themselves. There is a story called the Eternal Hunter, and it's a piece of Pennsylvania German folklore most frequently told down around York, Lancaster area. And it was about in the mid 1700s, there was a famine that swept through the land. The water dried up and there was a drought, so there wasn't enough crops. And subsequently, that fall and winter, the foodstuffs ran out very quickly. And there was a young man who was a hunter who had a pack of dogs and he hunted with the dogs. And he vowed that he was going to find game to feed the village that he lived in. And he was known to be a very good hunter. But you can imagine how anxious everybody was. They were literally scraping to find anything to eat. And he was going to be like their last hope kind of a deal. And so they were all calling out to him, you go get them, you find some livestock, because frankly, the deer were moving out of the area. There wasn't anything for them to eat either because the grasses and stuff had gone. And, so they were moving out. So that meant that wild game was very scarce. They'd already eaten up whatever they had domestically at the farms. And now this was it. So that one cold fall night, he took off hunting, hoping to find something. And the last thing he said is, I'll be damned by the devil or I'll bring back food. And he took off. He never returned. But it is said that he and his pack are heard on cold October nights. And they're sometimes seen as well, wandering through the forest, eternally hunting, looking for something to bring home to the village so that he won't be damned.
So what did the village do for food?
People ended up leaving the area. The place kind
Mm.
of became a ghost town, Eventually, when he didn't come back in a couple days, people started packing up and moving out. Even though they had to prove up that land, and that's a hard job, clearing land and building a house, and you had to give it all up.
Never done it myself, but yeah, I can only imagine the work that was required to do that.
And just the very thought of how much labor went into, clearing a piece of ground, pulling the stumps, building a house, tilling it by hand, most likely, planting your crops, and now you have to walk away. But it's an old legend, and it's told very, very often in Octobers down in Lancaster and York County. And that's one way you can curse yourself. Another way you can curse yourself, well, Al Capone had a story. And this
Oh,
actually took place in Philadelphia. He was imprisoned in Philadelphia for a while due to tax evasion.
I recall.
Now,
Yeah.
he didn't have a regular cell because he was a very well-to-do man. And so Capone had an apartment in the prison. He had carpeting, he had music, he had a little library, some very nice furniture, what have you. So it was definitely not the average prison cell. And it was there that the first time that this particular event occurred. Capone would come to believe that he was cursed, that he had been cursed by an act he had committed. So many people are familiar, in at least in general, with the concept of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. So basically what happened is that Capone supposedly ordered a hit on a rival gang. And on Valentine's Day, they decided they would do the hit. They went to this garage that was owned by one of the rival gang members. They came in dressed as cops. So the gang members, knowing they hadn't been doing anything, they were just in the garage hanging out, they weren't defensive. They were not overly suspicious, and they figured they'd just talk to the cops and let it go. So they walked right into the garage, pulled the guns out, and started blazing. What they didn't know was that Al Capone's brother-in-law was there talking to one of those guys on a completely innocuous topic, but he happened to be there at that moment, and he was one of the men killed. So Capone was in this prison, Eastern State Penitentiary, which is very famous for its hauntings. And one night he began shrieking insanely, and the guards came running, and they're like, "What's wrong, Mr. Capone? What's going on?" And he was like, he was in here, and he named his brother-in-law. And then they're like, "Sir, there is nobody in here." And he calmed down a little bit, and he's like, I must have fallen asleep. It was a dream. But over the course of the months that he was there, he would see his brother-in-law many times. There were many nights that he would wake up shrieking, or he would not go to sleep and encounter his brother-in-law, who never said anything to him, but just stood there and glared at him. And even after he got out, he continued to see him. He would end up at Alcatraz, and he would see him there. Now, by the time he got to Alcatraz, he had syphilis, and by then his mind was slipping. But at the point when he started this, years and years earlier, his mind was perfectly fine. But he believed himself to have been cursed because he had murdered an innocent man.
Innocent being a pretty relative term, I would suppose. Yeah.
I mean, like, I've never really came across a whole lot of stuff that the guy did. I mean, I don't know if he was one of the members or not, but he was just a brother-in-law. And if he was, it very well could have been a relative term. But he knew that he wasn't meant to be part of that mess. And and that's not the only one. There's a really cool story from Pennsylvania. Not cool for the Trotter family, but I've always been a big fan of Mad Anthony Wayne, who was one of the least known and most colorful figures in the American Revolutionary period. And Wayne has about a good odd half dozen ghost stories attached to him. But there's one story where he and his actions got him cursed. So basically the story was, he had an aide by the name of Trotter. And Trotter was very devoted to Anthony Wayne. And Anthony Wayne was not an easy man. He would take these drinking binges and become just roaring drunk, and they called it the black anger would take over, and he would just order insane things and do terrible things to people, and then sober up and go, "Oh gee, I'm sorry," kind of a deal. So they were in this particular area in Pennsylvania, which wasn't too far from Trotter's home, and a word had come to him that there had been a family emergency. And he went to Anthony Wayne, and he said, "Sir, may I have leave to go home and take care of this family emergency, since I'm only a day's walk away?" And Wayne was in the middle of one of his binge drinking fits, and he yelled, "Get out of here, go, just go." And he threw a boot at him. Well, he took it to mean go. Yes, you can go. So he took off, and he headed for home to take care of his family emergency. He had a couple days, he figured, and then he'd have to come back. So he goes and he takes care of what's going on. And in the meantime, Wayne sobers up a little bit, and he wants to know, "Where's Trotter?" And they said, "Well, sir, Trotter's gone. You told him he could go on leave and go home." And he's like, "I never said any such thing." And he got really angry. And he was still in his cups pretty deep. And he, the more he drank, the madder he got, the more violent became his curses and carrying on. And he finally went out and he said, if that trotter's not back by the end of tonight, I want him hung. And he sent men out to look for him. Well, Trotter didn't make it back till the next morning. And he was on his way back whenever one of these groups of men found him. And they told him what had happened. And he's like, no, that's, you know, other people heard. He said, go. And there's like, you know, we're sorry, but he told us if we didn't hang you, that he'd hang us. And they hung him. Well, meantime, Wayne sobered up a little bit. Sorry about the kitty cats. I got kitty cats here. So Wayne sobered up a little bit and realized what he had done, that he had stuck this, you know, death sentence on a man who was a really good aide and a decent human being, by all accounts. A good friend to him most of the time. So he called it off, but he didn't call it off soon enough. They had gotten to him and hung him before another group of men made it out to tell them to stop. And it was after that that Wayne would say in his journals and tell different people, there wasn't a day that went by that he didn't see Trotter standing beside him, behind him, or in the distance staring at him balefully. And he said, I mean, I physically saw him every day. And he said, I cursed myself to be haunted forever by my actions. And he, you know, seemed to have changed a lot about himself after that. His black drinking binges eased up considerably. And, but, you know, that's one of the ways you can haunt yourself. You can curse yourself into it, or you can believe yourself into it. If you believe something to be so, you'll make it happen. And, you know, and so I think that's one of the ways that people get cursed. There's others, murders where, you know, people have been cursed by the murder that they've committed, or, you know, I'd like to tell the story of the Zoot Suit Man. And then I want to go on to one of my favorite stories of cursed objects. It's not as well known as the Conjuring Chest, but it is definitely a fascinating story. So this is also my story. This is a family story.
Okay.
When I was about 18 years old, we moved into this old farmhouse outside of my hometown. And it was that house where everybody would say, oh my gosh, you're moving there? You know it's haunted. But they never had a story about it. You know what I mean? It just had a local reputation. It was a beautiful big old farmhouse, 5 bedrooms, just a nice old farmhouse. And it was in this house where these events occurred. So this house had a what they call a salt box staircase, basically a built-in staircase. So you had to walk down the staircase. It wasn't open on one side with a banister. It was just a built-in wall on both sides. And every night it was my job to go down the stairs and then through the kitchen and down into the basement, fix the fire in the middle of the night, and then go back upstairs and go to bed. I'd fix it again in the morning and before school. And my mom would get it before she went to work, and so on throughout the winter. And I started to have these horrible nightmares about a man. This man was, so in the dream, I would go down the stairs, down to the basement, fix the fire, start back up the stairs, and I'd feel, you know how that feeling whenever somebody's watching you and you just know they are? That creepy feeling, that sensation up your back?
All the time.
Yeah. And so I had that feeling in the dream, and I made myself turn around because I always felt that way on those stairs. And this time there was a man standing at the foot of the stairs in the dream. And the man was about 5'7". I can see him to this day. He had his head down. He had a big slouch brim hat on. He had a half cape that came down to his knees, pushed back, a sort of baggy suit with pinstripes, white pinstripes. It was dark blue with white pinstripes. And his head was down, like on his chin touching his chest almost. And I could see blonde hair. And he slowly raised his head, and his face was rotted and his eyes were red. But I knew he had once been the most beautiful thing around. I just knew. And at that moment, I was terrified. So I took off down the hallway to my bedroom, and I slammed my way into the bedroom. There was a little deadbolt on the door, and I slammed the deadbolt. And in the dream, I turn around, and he's inside the room with me, and he has a knife in his hand. I see it glowing in the street light, and just as it would come down on my throat right here, I would scream and startle awake every morning. This went on for a couple months,
Months.
nightly, months, to the point I would sit up all night to avoid that dream. And after a month and a half, 2 months of this, I'm sitting in the kitchen one day. I'm talking to my sister, who's 4.5 years younger than me and never lets me forget it. And she says to me, I've been having these really scary dreams. And I'm like, really? She's like, yeah. Now, her dream was a different series of events, but it was the same man. So she dreamt that she was in her bedroom, and there was a little child in her bed, and she was very worried about this child because the child was sick. And there was a man in the doorway, and she thought he was the doctor. And she's telling this man, who's kind of shadowed in the doorway there, you need to help because I think this little one's really sick, and we need your help, doctor. Please hurry. And the man steps into the light, and she sees the exact same man dressed the exact same way. And he walked over, he grins at her, he picks up a pillow, and he smothers the child
Oh
in
my.
front of her.
Yeah.
And I would come to learn that the suit that we were seeing was called a zoot suit. It was popular in the 20s and 30s, very baggy. And he had a watch fob, a gold watch fob, and a gold chain, and everything was exactly the same. I mean, down to details like that. Well, that's pretty creepy for, a 14-year-old and a 18-year-old to have this happen. So I said, we need to tell mom. And so when my mom came home from work this one day, I told her the story. Georgie told her the story, and my mom was less than sympathetic. She said to me, this is what comes of you reading ghost stories all the time, Patty. And I was like, no, I've read ghost stories forever. And she's like, I want to hear any more about it. And then she said something that was a little odd. She said, I want you to go down and get sheets and come change my bed, which I never did that. She always took care of that stuff for herself. We were all responsible for our own rooms. So I was really hurt and angry, and I went downstairs and got her sheets, and I went frumping back up the steps into her room, and she's sitting on the bed. And I said, you're going to have to move if I have to change your sheets. And she said, I don't need you to change my sheets, but I wanted to get you away from Georgie. And I said, for what? And she said, because I need to tell you a story. I know exactly who you saw. I saw him a long time ago, and I think it's my fault that you've seen him. Well, that pretty much took the thunder out of me. So I sat on the bed, and this is what she told me. When she was 17 years old, she wanted to be a missionary, and she finished high school. And during the summer before she went to missionary school, which was in Cleveland, Tennessee, she took a job working for this family, and they had to be away on an extended visit for a family emergency, I guess a death in the family or something. So she was to spend 2 weeks sleeping at the house with their children, their two young sons, while they did whatever it is they had to do. And then she would be paid extra for this, which was great because she was trying to save up enough money to get to school and everything. So the way a lot of the old Pennsylvania German bedrooms are built, there's a big room, and then you go through the big room into the smaller bedroom. And that's how this house was built. So she had the smaller inner bedroom, and they had the boys had the larger outer bedroom. She was asleep in her bed, and she said she woke up to what looked like flickering, like flames. And her first thought was, oh my goodness, the house is on fire. I got to get the kids out. That's exactly what she thought. She smelled smoke and brimstone smells, and she threw her feet over the side of the bed and then froze. Standing at the foot of the bed was that man. And he stepped up into the light, and she kind of crawled back up into the bed and backed herself against the headboard. And she's like, who are you and what do you want? And he said, you're not going to the missionary college, are you? She said, yes, I am. And he said, "You're not going to the missionary college, are you?" She said, "Yes, I am." And she's getting more frightened by the second. And his eyes glowed red at her. And he said, "If you go to the missionary college, I will come and I will get you. And if I can't get you, I will get your children or your children's children." And she began to what they call plead the blood, which is a prayer, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I plead the blood of Christ. And he started yelling at her to shut up, shut up. And she just kept doing it over and over again. And then she said it went, and the flickering went, and it was just over. And she said, "I thought all those years that I had somehow dreamt it or escaped it until today." She said Georgie wasn't old enough to understand what she was telling me, but I was. That he hadn't gotten her, that he was coming through to her children and trying to come to us. I would like to add that my oldest son and my middle son have both encountered him, and they did not know the story until after they had their encounters with him.
Any continued threats, or just the very presence of?
It's just this overwhelming terror at the moment that you see him, and it's always about the fear. Excuse me, I apologize. And for my oldest son, he saw him for months. And perhaps the scariest part for him was he dreamt that he was being entangled in briars, and this man was laughing as he was being pulled down in these briars, and they were wrapping around him. And I remember him screaming, and I would go over, and he wouldn't tell me at first what it was. And one night he was screaming really, yelling, and I went running over, and I pulled off the blankets and I grabbed him up. He was about 11 at that time. And I was like, "Are you okay? Are you okay? Wake up, wake up." And he's like, "It's all over my legs. It's all over my legs." And I looked at his legs, and he had scratches all over his legs, bleeding on to the sheets. I can't explain it. I couldn't find anything in there. There wasn't a cat in the room. There wasn't anything in the bed to explain it, but these were fresh bleeding scratches. And that's about as real world as this thing ever got. The rest of it's been intimidation.
Have you ever encountered other stories of other people having similar encounters, like that, generational encounters?
Right. There are generational curses. The Kennedys are one of the families that come to mind. There's a lot of Irish families and Scottish families that have these generational curses. The Kennedys is that none of the men, their men would become great, but they would be cut off early. And if you look at the Kennedy family history, all of the young Kennedys, the Kennedys that were making a huge splash, not just Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy, but if you go back generationally, it has been that way. Even up to John Kennedy's son, John Jr., who was, for the first time stepping out on his own and created that magazine, George, and was doing really well. And then a freak accident.
Yeah, it's so. This is sound bad. Whenever you mentioned made a splash, and the first thing I thought was Teddy Kennedy and Chappaquiddick making a
Well,
splash.
I mean, if you think about it, in a way, he was a victim of it too, because he was at that time really popular. They were making murmurings about him, going beyond that, and he destroyed his life. But like John Kennedy didn't do anything overtly other than annoy people because he was trying to push through a policy that he believed in. And Robert Kennedy, likewise, he was, going after the mobs and the big businesses and what have you. But as to saying that they did anything that could have impacted it other than acquiescing, they were just living their lives, being the people they believed they should have been, doing what they believed to be right. But there are many such curses.
Yeah. Any ideas of the origin of such a curse? Both for the Kennedys and even what you had described.
Well, the Kennedy curse goes back to a story about a Kennedy many, like back in the 1500s, who um, was coveting a piece of ground that an old couple owned, and they bore false witness against this couple and um, set them up for theft that they didn't commit, and that on their execution, the man cursed the family that their sons would be cut down early. All their successful, healthy sons would be cut down early. As for mine, my guess is my mother not giving in. Something spiritual did not want her to be a spiritual warrior, and her dabbling in that world, trying to stop things, had annoyed something, and it came to back her down. And when it couldn't back her down, it decided to come after her children and her children's children.
I guess, most of us sitting in our comfortable homes, we don't think that such evil exists, but it certainly does.
It does. And like, I think that's part of what ended up happening for myself, was that we had to go one way or the other, and I had to learn to deal with all of this because there isn't any choice. It wasn't, something I had any choice in doing or not doing.
It made me wonder if other people had seen the Zoot Suit Man, because not that he wore a zoot suit, but I mean
Right.
the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, Freddy Krueger wore the stripe. Now those were horizontal stripes,
Right.
but those stripes, almost suit-like, stripes,
Right.
made that appearance. And somebody had to write that. Somebody had to come up with that idea, and it just makes me wonder if the writers of that may have had a similar encounter, and they took a real life thing and actually created that movie.
Well,
The
they
movie
say art
out of it.
mimics, yeah, they say art mimics life. And I'm sure there have been other people who have seen something along those lines, but there are just so many of those stories, and they just, I won't say they fascinate me. I've had to deal with a couple curses in my lifetime from other people, as part of cases and things like that. And it's just, it's a difficult thing to understand because people don't think curses are real, but they are in some respects. I mean, I get the idea that, like voodoo, they'll say things about voodoo, that voodoo is just, mind over matter, imagination, and all that. But I have to tell you, just judging from the fact that my sister and I had never heard that story, we had no clue. And then it happened to us, and that's when Mom confessed this whole thing, thinking that, she had thought that this was left behind in her life. And she didn't think it would ever impact on anybody else, truthfully, until that day. So, it is
And
what it is.
were your sons at approximately the same age as you and your sister whenever the incidents happened?
Yes, my oldest was 11 when it started, and my middle boy, Mike, was about 13. And interestingly enough, it was a ghost that stopped this entity from harassing Michael.
Oh,
We would go to a place that was known to be haunted, and one of the spirits there was a spirit by the nickname of Sarge. He had been a sergeant in the Vietnam War and had died, and was very active in this building. And we were there after this whole thing had started. We were there, and the nightmares were going for Michael and what have you. And I just said one day, while I was there, I said, I wish somebody could do something about it. And that night, Michael said he had the dream again, the same dream that he had had before. It's always your own individual interpretation. Like mine was the knife, hers was the smothering, but it was a different, one, but it was always the same figure. And in that dream, for the first time, this large Indian man, Native American man, stepped up. And the Sarge was Native American. And he stood in front of the spirit and told this whatever this entity was, that this boy was under his protection. And eventually the dreams stopped while we were down there. We were staying for about a week, and they never visited him again.
so I'm assuming you're keeping an eye out on your grandchildren.
Of course. as always,
Mhm.
because we don't know how long that will go. Of course, they're all very young, and I'm hopeful it won't happen, but I'm also cognizant of the fact that there are particularly certain ones of my grandchildren that are already showing signs of being sensitive and things of that nature. So I keep a particular weather eye on them. Is, I think they'd probably be the easiest candidates for him to go after.
Mm. Yeah, again, what would have, just I guess this entity just picked your mother just
Well, I
because
I
she
think
wanted to do missionary work? Mm.
it was because she was a powerful warrior for God, and she was. I mean, she was not mediocre at anything she did, and she was planning a career in disrupting evil, like actively seeking it out and disrupting it. And apparently, evil didn't like that, so it just became what it was. And I have one last story I'd like to share. So there is a
Okay.
um, called a Conjured Chest, and it was a story I came across in the Kentucky Historical Site. It's interesting that the Kentucky Historical Society has some amazingly cool artifacts and some objects that are supposed to be cursed. There is, um, you know, there's a blanket that's a quilt. It's supposed to be cursed. But my favorite object, and the one I've actually done a little bit of reading on, was something called the Conjured Chest. So basically, the story is that there was a gentleman by the name of Jeremiah Graham. He was not a very nice man who uh, owned a bunch of slaves. He had one gentleman who was a slave who was a very good woodworker, and he ordered this man to build a great big storage chest for his soon-to-be born son's bedroom. So it was his first child coming, and he wanted to deck the room out, and he wanted this chest built for the child. The man did an amazing job. I've actually seen the chest. It was gorgeous. But for some reason, Jeremiah Graham didn't like it. It didn't fit whatever parameters he had given this man. So the African American man's name was Remus, and he had Remus beaten, and Remus died from his injuries. And then another man who was one of Remus's associates, basically another woodworker who worked on the farm, came in, and as was tradition where this gentleman came from, he sprinkled owl's blood in the chest and said these prayers over it because he didn't want Remus to haunt him. But what he did is inadvertently, it seems, is attached Remus's spirit to the chest. And Remus's spirit is none too happy about everything that happened. So during the course of the history of this chest, it was kept in the same family. So the Graham family owned the chest until the 19, I believe it was in the 1980s or something like that, whenever they were first approached about if they would take the chest. So according to the folklore, there were 18 people, first one being Jeremiah Graham's firstborn son, who died in infancy with the chest in the room with him. Then Jeremiah's twin brother Jonathan had a son, and his clothes were placed in that chest and he was stabbed by a servant as a small child. Um, then the chest was moved to the attic where his sister-in-law Anna Graham um, put clothes. She was killed. Then John Ryan, a immigrant from Ireland, had eloped with one of the Graham women. She was named Catherine Winchell, and the chest was given to her. And as soon as she started using the chest, she grew ill and she died. Her husband had the chest, and he was killed in an accident. Um, then Louis Gregory, a child of the family, died at the age of 10 whenever the chest was moved into his bedroom. And it goes on and on and on all the way through the whole 18 people up until it was finally donated. It is said that there was a woman named Sally who was a maid who'd worked in the house, and she opened the conjured chest and found owl feathers. And she said, um, "You need to break this curse." And she knew a lot about things like this, so she needed a dead owl. And she went and she got a dead owl, and she tried to break the curse. And there was a lot more to it than that. They had to boil willow branches and do all this stuff, and then bury it and what have you. But it didn't seem to work because Virginia and the other lady who was helping her, they died while they were trying to break the curse. And it was at that point that the family decided to never use the chest again. They didn't know what to do with it. It was a beautiful antique piece. So they decided that the safest thing to do was to impart it to the Historical Society with their agreement and knowledge that this chest is cursed and that they should never use it for any purpose other than display. So when I read the story, I was really fascinated. So I actually wrote to the Kentucky Historical Society, and this lovely person wrote back and said, "Yes, let me confirm all of the details you just asked for. In fact, let me send you a copy of the original letter outlining all of this that we received from the Graham descendant who actually gave us the chest." And it's a fascinating story. And obviously, the chest was haunted or cursed because this man who made it was beaten and killed, basically for no reason at all.
Yeah, unjustly, yes. Yeah.
Certainly so. And his anger has attached to the chest.
Yeah, that's not the only object like that you've told a story about. I recall one that you told, I can't remember how long ago, but about a chair in a bar that if anyone sat in it.
Yeah, there's a chair. It's called Busby's chair, I believe it is. And the story goes that this guy Busby, it was in England. There's a bar, and the chair actually hangs up on the wall. And the story was that Busby cursed anybody who sat in his chair. He got arrested and hung, and he said for a crime he didn't commit. And anybody that sat in the chair after that seemed to die within days. So, out of an abundance of caution, the owners of the inn hung the chair up there, and it made a great barroom story, I'm sure, for them. But there's other stories like that. There's a Philadelphia mansion where there's a haunted chair. And again, it's also a death chair. They've actually got it roped off so that nobody can sit in this chair. We'll have to delve into that story another day. But and then there's other such things. In Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, there's a handprint, a bloody handprint on the wall of the old prison from a man who was innocent. And he said the print will never disappear from that day till the end of time, in proof of the fact he was innocent. And the jail still exists. It's now been used like for ghost hunting and stuff like that. But that handprint's been there for 150 years. It's been painted over and everything else, but it still keeps coming out, and they can't explain it.
Not non-paranormically.
Well, yes, I mean, if
Yes,
you want to
yeah.
go with a ghost story, yeah, but there are just so many of those kinds of stories where people either curse themselves or their actions curse them or they stumble into it in some way. And I just thought that today we would share a few of those stories because there are so many. And I'll leave you with one last ghost story. This one actually is partly my story as well. There was a building called the Lincoln Hotel up on Route 30 outside of Bedford, headed towards Shelburne. It's an old hulk of a building now, but it was once a very popular bar. And out behind it, there was sat an old narrow gauge train engine, number 42. Now, I stopped in the place, oh gosh, almost 30 years ago now, and the then owner told me the ghost stories of the building, and he said, you know, that old train engine is supposed to be haunted too. I don't know a whole lot about it, but I bought it at an auction. He was an antique dealer, so if anybody's ever had an antique dealer in your family, they are pack rats and extraordinaire. Everything has a purpose, and I can't imagine going home and saying, honey, I bought a train. But he bought a train, at least a train engine. Now, the story, as I came to learn it, was that it had been used for a while on, there was a coal mining in the area, and it had been used to run coal from one area to another so it could be delivered. And you would have to back the cars up and then to the, so that they could be filled. And then they would just dump it out of this shuttle that was up high. And at the end of the track, there was no brake work or anything like that to stop it. The engineer just had to pay attention. Well, it was a very slow, tedious process. And if you had 20 or 30 cars, it took hours to do. And he fell asleep at the switches, if you will, and he continued to back the train up further than it could go, and it shot off the end of the track into the building below it and killed somebody. But
Oh,
that's only one of the stories. The next story was that after that, the train was repaired and put back into production, and it ran for about a year and a half, and then one day there was this loud noise, a pinging or like a shot or something going off. And one of the steam lines, this was a steam train, one of the steam lines let loose and cooked the engineer alive in the car
oh,
in seconds, literally. And after that, it was a couple years until that train engine was put back online. And a lot of people didn't want to work on it. They said it was a hoodoo train, that everybody that worked on it ended up getting hurt or killed. And it went down through a huge series of such accidents. And then eventually was nobody would work on this train. So they finally retired it and sold it to a museum. It was a train museum up in New York State. And the proviso was that it would only be used for exhibit. Nobody would ride on it. So they didn't want it on a track. It was a beautiful piece of equipment and what have you. And then through a series of things that happened, the train museum basically ended up having to shut down financially. It got into a bad state, and all the trains got sold. This train got put up for auction. The gentleman who I talked to bought it and brought it down there, and it was sitting in a big old hayfield. And so when I was doing the story for one of my very first books, I think it was actually my very first book, um, I decided to get some pictures of I wanted to tell the story of the Lincoln Hotel, and while I'm up there, I might as well tell the train story as well.
sure.
So I decided to take the pictures of the old hotel and wade out through the grass, hoping not to see any snakes, and take the pictures of this train engine sitting in the middle of this hayfield. And when I got the pictures back, these were the old, for those who are old enough to remember, the 35 millimeter film, that nobody seems to use much anymore.
Yeah, go to the drugstore or the photomat.
Yep.
Mhm.
So when the pictures were taken, and I took them and got them developed, one picture was fascinating to me. Now, this was a really hot August afternoon, bright, hot sun. And the only picture that I found anomalous out of that bunch of pictures was in one of the shots of the train engine. I got the door that the engineer would have gone in and out. So it got a kind of a broad view of the whole thing. And there's a white mass in that doorway, and it was in the original books. You could see it. We put it in that way, just the way it was. But through the fact of all these accidents, the train became known as a cursed train, and nobody wanted to deal with it anymore. It literally pulled it off the track, and that's not the only such story. We'll sometimes sit down and just tell a bunch of train stories because I happen to be a train girl, and there are tons of haunted or cursed trains that have been so associated with death and misery that entire crews have walked off rather than, give up a job rather than having to drive them.
Right. The only question I have is, a train is normally transported on a track.
Yes.
How does a train engine get in the middle of a field?
He had it brought in on the back of a truck and dumped. They slid it down into the field.
Okay.
That was a question I asked as well. I'm like, how did it get parked up there?
I would have liked to have seen that process because, well, steam engines, the ones that I've seen,
Yeah.
are not small things.
Yeah, it was about half the size of what we normally think of as a steam engine because it was narrow gauge, but it
Okay.
was still a hefty thing but he had it brought in on the back of a flatbed and delivered there. Oh, your kitty cat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Miss Cassie.
Cassie. My Loki's the one who was doing the vocalizations in the background throughout the episode for those who care to know.
Mm-hmm.
But
Well, when I leave my office door open, she comes in and visits. Don't you, sweetie? Yes, you do.
yes, Loki decided as soon as we began to record that it was time for a cuddle, and I wasn't able to oblige. So he's now curled up on the edge of the bed waiting for me.
Can I say hi?
Hey, Cassie, how are you, sweetheart? Yeah. She's like, I'm with my daddy. I'm happy.
Mm-hmm. This is she'll sit here for hours. If I were to hold her now, geez, cat, she's rather heavy. She's, you can see she's not a little girl. So
That's how Loki is. He's like 30 some pounds and he's heavy to hold.
yeah, I can't imagine. So.
And he thinks he's a kitten, so he wants held all the time.
So those are some thoroughly enjoyable stories. I like those. And if our viewers and listeners have liked those as well, please click the like button that's down below this video if you're watching it on YouTube. We do get some metrics back from the different audio only platforms. So if you like it, we get some feedback that way too. Let us know. On YouTube, click the subscribe button, click the little bell, get notified whenever we publish new content. Check us out on our Facebook page, theparanormalistpodcast.com. Email at paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com. Tell us your stories, and who knows, one of your ideas could become a future episode.
Right now we're working on putting together some stories about cats. I've had a couple of our folks who listen to us share some of their stories, and I can't wait to share them all with you.
Can't wait to share mine too.
I know, I can't wait for them to hear it. That's a good story. So we wish everybody a good evening.
Thank you, Patty. Good night.
Night.